सदाशिवसमारम्भां शङ्कराचार्यमध्यमाम् अस्मदाचार्यपर्यन्तां वन्दे गुरुपरम्पराम्. Om. So, namaste and welcome. I'm delighted to introduce our speakers, Kundan Singh ji and Krishna Maheshwari ji, who have co-authored a very important and relevant book. It's called The Colonial Discourse and the Suffering of Indian American Children. So, as we discuss the various topics pertaining to the book, I would just ask both of you to introduce yourselves, give a little bit of background about who you are, where you're from, what you've studied, and really just to give us a better sense of the foundations of this book as well.
Sure. So my name is Krishna. I started Hindupedia in 2007 because I saw a need really to help students, because when they went to study Hinduism in the West, in academia in the US, by and large, they ended up anti-Hindu at the other end. And the underlying cause is a very deep-rooted Hindu phobia or Hindu-misia, and a lack of access to content in English that made sense. And frankly, and had an insider's perspective. It was the only field of religious studies where an outsider's perspective outvalued that of an insider's perspective. We started with a Hindu encyclopedia to give them something to start with. And over time, we learned that the depth of Hindu-misia was much, much greater, and helping students wasn't sufficient. We continued with work on textbooks. That's where Kundan ji and I met at the State Board of Education. And then ultimately decided that it made sense for us to partner so we could go deeper. And so together we've been going inside academia versus just participating in academia. There have been a number of papers and foundational theories that Kundan has published through peer-reviewed journals. And then the work that ended in Sacramento in 2018 with the rejection of Houghton Mifflin Harcourt continued behind the scenes and led fundamentally to this book.
Got it. And Kundanji, if you can share
So
some.
as far as I'm concerned, this journey started a long time ago. My bachelor's is in chemistry and my master's is in applied psychology. I'm not going to go into the details of why I switched from studying chemistry to psychology, but when I made the switch and when I started studying the discipline, I figured out that psychology in India was completely Western, and it wasn't really addressing the Indian sensibilities. And there was another problem that I encountered, which was that there are many different schools in psychology, and they all claim scientific status for themselves. So given that I had a science background, I got thoroughly confused about the discipline with respect to what was right and what was wrong, or which theory was more true or truer than others. So to cut the long story short, I got into studying philosophy of science. I already had that background. And when I critically examined psychology, I found that there was a lot that psychology as a discipline needed to do. And this pursuit of mine was very much intertwined with the pursuit of ultimate truth. And that led me to Pondicherry, where I opened up quite extensively to the writings of the mother and Sri Aurobindo. And that brought me to the California Institute of Integral Studies, where I did my PhD in interdisciplinary humanities. So there were many things that happened in this journey. One was, with respect to epistemology. How do we pursue knowledge? How do we get to knowledge? And while I was pursuing this, I figured out that the Western world pursues knowledge in a particular way, and the Indian way is completely different. The Western epistemology has legitimacy in academia at this point in time. Unfortunately, the Indian world does not have legitimacy, but it is very systematic. Epistemology and methodology within the Indian context is very, very systematic. it does not have legitimacy. That's the crux of the matter. But it was when I was writing my dissertation on Sri Aurobindo, as I was trying to connect his worldview or his writings with Swami Vivekananda and Sri Ramakrishna, that I discovered that there is a lot of Hindu-phobic literature which is there on Swami Vivekananda in academia. So that was my first exposure to academic Hinduphobia or Hindumesia, if you will. And because of this discovery, I must say that I also encountered a lot of trouble sort of uh, finishing my dissertation, because my dissertation chair subscribed to the mainstream views, whereas my understanding was that this is nothing but falsehood and untruth, if you will. And that truth is something very different. So for that, I needed to uh, expose or explore what the truth was, which I have captured in my book called The Evolution of Integral Yoga. So this was my background. After I finished my PhD in 2008, I started teaching. I started teaching at Sophia University. And then it was around 2015 that I came across this textbook issue. People here in the Bay Area were fighting this battle, and I was approached by one of the organizations to give them help in the matter. And that is when I started studying the material for the first time. And to cut the long story short, we'll go into the details later. While I was deposing against the Hindu-phobic textbook materials, which are widely prevalent in Sacramento, that I bumped into Krishna, and we started our conversation, and we decided to collaborate. So it's a long story that we have to narrate in a very short while, but this is how the book happened.
That's wonderful. And just to give a little bit of context to the viewers, could you just give a little bit of an elaboration on what the textbook issue was?
Yeah. So fundamentally, textbooks in California in grade 6 and grade 7 present Hinduism, Hindu Dharma, in India in an extremely negative and prejudiced manner. There are many different ways to look at it. One way is to look at it in terms of, are they presenting the right facts? Another way to look at it is, are they presenting in an equitable way relative to all the other religions of the world? And fundamentally at play is the fact that it's not equitable representation. According to the California Constitution, every religion and every tradition should be presented in a way that keep children secure in their beliefs, their traditions, and their background. This is true of every other religion and every other people that was discussed, but is extremely untrue when it comes to how they present India and Hinduism.
That makes sense.
So
yeah, go ahead, Kundanji.
The problem that I found was that apart from falsehoods that are generated in the textbook discourse, there is a strong influence of Orientalism in academia. So that was the first thing that I realized, that there's a colonial connect with the discourse. I had not studied the materials earlier, but because I have background in post-colonial studies, I could completely see that the tropes were quite colonial and Orientalist in representation. And interestingly, at that point in time, the group with which I was fighting the battle was trying to fight the battle on the basis of evidence. And I told them that the matter was much more serious. The representation were Orientalist in nature, and by default, they were racist in nature. So we needed to kind of shift our focus and talk about the Orientalism which was present in the discourse, rather than trying to fight the battle on the basis of evidence. Because in any case, because the Western world has been writing on these topics for a very long period of time, for about 200-250 years, they have generated a lot of evidence. These are false evidence, pieces of evidence, but they're still in academia. They have written tomes on it. So my approach was completely different. Instead of contesting the textbook discourse on the basis of evidence, it was to point out the Orientalist tropes which were which were present in the textbook discourse.
Got it. So, speaking about these tropes themselves and coming to the title of the book, what are some of the key characteristics of a colonial discourse?
This is basically, what the book goes into. And in order to do that, we had to do a bit of archaeology of knowledge. We went into the writings of this individual by the name of James Mill. So James Mill, he wrote the first comprehensive history of British India in English literature. And the work was published in 1817. It's a 3-volume work. And in the first volume itself, there are 7 chapters on Hindus. And while he's describing Hinduism, and ancient India, his agenda was to show the Hindu people and the Hindu civilization completely savage and barbaric. He's using terms like uh, uncivilized, uncouth, barbaric, barbarous, rude, and so on and so forth, quite liberally. These terms are present in a substantial measure in those 7 chapters. And as he's describing the Hindu people in such terms, he is generating a narrative on the Hindu people. He's talking about, the Hindu social system, the Hindu forms of governance, the Hindu taxation structure, Hindu uh, manners and customs, and finally, Hinduism itself. He does not use the term Hinduism, but he talks about the religion of Hindus. So, within this canopy or this container of describing the Hindus uncivilized and uncouth, he gives a certain description. Now, in the current context, it would be absolutely politically incorrect to talk about.
Now you're back.
Now we got it.
Okay, I don't know what happened. Fully charged. Will we be able to edit this, Prashant, later?
Sure.
Okay. So, so within this larger container of describing Hindus and Hinduism, uncivilized and uncouth, he gives a certain description. What you find in the textbooks at this point in time is that the same coordinates that he used to describe Hindus and Hinduism way back in the 19th century are getting reflected in sanitized and politically correct terms. This is a massive expose that we are actually making in this book. In fact, what we have done is that after we discussed this discourse, we drew exact parallels, exact correspondences between the writings of James Mill and the narrative that you find in the framework, which is the syllabus, which is given to publishers for producing textbooks, and the textbook materials. That correspondence is absolutely clear. And then there's chapter 4 in the book, where we go on to show that the entire discourse is nothing but imagination. And why we say this is because James Mill was a political figure in England. There's a bit of history to that, but I'll come to that later. Krishna, do you want to add anything to this?
Actually, I wanted to emphasize the point you're about to get to. So keep
Yeah.
going. Yeah,
Okay, so that's wonderful.
the crux and the most important part. So please.
Right, right. I'm glad that we're having this conversation because uh, there's a bit of history to James Mill. James Mill was born in 1773 in England, and he came from a very humble background. So the local aristocrats were able to recognize that he was a precocious child, and they wanted him to become preacher, because of which uh, they took him under their wings, and he was educated at University of Edinburgh for his master's in divinity studies. This he completed in 1797. For the next 5 years or so, he looked for a permanent job as a preacher, which he could not find. And then in 1802, he came to London, which was a city of opportunities back then, to try his luck in journalism. So from 1802 onwards, this individual turns from a preacher to a journalist, and he starts writing for many different journals and newspapers. Now, somewhere around 1806, he decides to write this work on the history of British India. This was when he conceptualized this idea. Now, in 1808, there was something very significant uh, occurrence that took place. He met the father of utilitarianism by the name of Bentham. Now, before I proceed with the story further, I need to tell you a little bit about Bentham. Bentham was quite concerned about the socio-political situation in England in which he found himself. The socio-political situation was massively hierarchical and oppressive. And Bentham wanted to transform that situation. He was a lawyer by profession, but very similar uh, to James Mill, he was not able to gain much success in the area or in the discipline in which he was trained. So he started writing and he started addressing these issues. He came across a principle, which is considered the axiom of the utilitarian movement. Greatest good for the greatest number.
Right.
This was the axiom, and this was around which he started producing his materials. Now, the interesting thing about Bentham was that Bentham was very sage-like. He was not a politically astute individual. So he produced all these materials, and then, he also had some disciples around him, but they were not worth much. Now, interestingly, James Mill was a very different sort of a figure. So he met with Bentham in 1808, and this camaraderie was wonderful in terms of making the utilitarian ideas popular in England. So what James Mill did was that he simplified the ideas of Bentham and took them to the masses. And while he was doing that, he wrote quite profusely on the socio-political conditions of England, of Britain. And as I mentioned earlier, the socio-political situation in Britain at that point in time was extremely hierarchical and oppressive. Money and power basically was in the hands of select few. And in this combination, you basically found uh, the monarch, the aristocrats, and the clergy. So James Mill wrote quite extensively on the monarchical system which was in existence in Britain at that point in time, as well as on aristocracy and clergy. Now, when I started doing this research, what I found was that there was this wonderful correspondence between his writings in history of British India with his socio-political writings for Britain. And this is where we figured out that James Mill projected the socio-political condition of Britain onto India. And all the conditions, between various groups that he found were projected onto Brahmins, Kshatriyas, and so on and so forth. So when James Mill is writing about the Hindu Brahmins, he's basically talking about English clergy. When he's talking about the Indian kings, he's talking about the monarchs of Britain. And when he's talking about the Indian Kshatriyas, he's talking about the aristocrats. And through this projection, basically, he created this discourse or narrative on India. And interestingly, James Mill never visited India. Now, the interesting part is that after the production of this book, James Mill gained political power as well. So, as I mentioned earlier, it was in 1817 that the book got produced, and it started selling like hotcakes right from the very beginning. In 1819, James Mill was hired by the East India Company. And by the time it was 1823, he was second in command of the hierarchy of officials that you found at the headquarters of the East India Company in London. So 1823 onwards, he was basically looking at, or rather looking after, the revenue department of the East India Company, which was one of the four departments. By the time it was 1830, James Mill became the chief of the East India Company headquarters. So in a certain sense, you can say that he became the CEO of the East India Company, because above him, was only the board of directors, which with its president as a British parliamentarian. So this treatise that he produced became governance manual for the East India Company officials, who were operating in India. The history of British India became the required textbook at Haileybury College, and this is where the training of the East India Company officials happened. Now, there's something more interesting. This story is very, very fascinating in the sense that there's a lot more that that we will be writing on in the future as well, because we have not unfolded the entire story. James Mill and his cohort, or other disciples of Bentham, also put together the University of London in 1825. So the materials that he generated became part of academia. So in a certain sense, the history of British India is basically the paradigm determiner on Hinduism and India studies. And that is the reason we find the reflection of the contents of the history of British India on the textbooks of children that we have critically analyzed. But the thing is that, you will find his reflections on everything related to India and Hinduism across the world at all stages of education.
I just want to emphasize one thing. When we were working at the state board, we had no choice but to use facts. And it was our facts versus someone else's facts. And even now, when I share this book with friends, they ask, well, why aren't you focusing on the facts? And this is the challenge of all Hindus everywhere. We tend to say, what are the facts and are they correct? And the underlying challenge here is what we're trying to introduce, which is you have to change your paradigm of thinking. In the scientific world, you don't try to disprove something that's fundamentally false. Right? If I tell you 1 + 1 is 3, you don't try to disprove that. You just say that's wrong. Right? And now if I say 1 + 1 is 3, and therefore 3 + 1 is 5, do you now go to prove that 3 + 1 is not 5? No, you say the basis is wrong, therefore all the things that derive from it are wrong.
Yes.
And let's move on. And what we're trying to do with this book is get people to understand that the narrative that we have is wrong because it's based on a work of fiction. Right? Kundanji talked about projection. It's a very specific term coming from the field of psychology. So I'll spell it out for everyone that's not versed. If you take your thoughts on topic A and you apply them to topic B as if they actually belong to topic B, that's projection. So he took his thoughts on Britain and the British system and just changed the label to Hinduism and India. That's all he did. Change the label, nothing else. That's projection. That's what he did. And everything that evolved from it was on that basis, right? Because it became the basis of academia and its study on India and Hinduism. And has continued for 6+ generations of scholarship. But no one thought to go back to the granddaddy of that narrative and examine, is that on the basis of truth or on the basis of fiction? And what Kundanji is walking us through is what led to the fundamental basis of narrative, a fundamental basis of the narrative, which is a work of fiction.
Sounds like a classic case of adhyasa.
Exactly. This is exactly what I was coming to, because your audience um, is will primarily be of an Advaita Vedanta background. I thought that that we should draw this parallel. It is adhyasa. So basically, it's exactly about how we start looking at a rope as a snake. So what James Mill was encountering, was a rope, and with his projections, he basically made into a snake.
And then made
that
believe that it's a snake.
Yeah. And now that snake has actually become real, because it not only sort of runs the discourse in academia on Hinduism and India studies, it is also determining the politics of India at this point in time. So as I mentioned earlier, there's a lot more that has to be revealed, but we sort of selected this field where we could completely expose the correspondence which exists between the writings of James Mill and the discourse that you find on Hinduism and India in the textbooks.
I think this is really important to understand the background and what lies at the root of this issue. So just one question I would have over here as a follow-up, that it sounds like James Mill and his cohorts had a genuine prejudice against Hindus. How can one ensure, or rather say with certainty, that it was prejudice and not just a deliberate move to break the Hindu spirit to better facilitate British control over the citizenry? So, how does one draw that conclusion, that this was a pure bias and not something that they were just, using as a means to control the people?
So, Prashantji, I'm going to challenge your question a little bit, because Kundanji started, at the time this work was written, James Mill was a journalist who had never taken a step in India. Right. So on what basis can we ascribe prejudice to him? On the other hand, he had encountered Bentham. And he was firmly rooted in his desire to improve Britain.
Right.
And his work was a tool he used to further utilitarianism. Now, it happened that he used it also politically to gain favor and then eventually become the head of the British East India Company. And everyone likes book sales. And he had a way to force it on the world. And he did. And then everyone else built on it. But the creation of the bias and the prejudice came from the reading of his work. And then was like, well, if he is saying they're savage, they must be savage. And therefore the prejudice has begun.
Right.
But the work and the savagery that he was describing was that of Britain under the name of Hindu and India.
Yes.
Would you disagree, Kundan?
No, in fact, I would say that, that you're bringing a beautiful point out. James Mill is the creator of prejudice against India and Hinduism. And his prejudice, interestingly, is not conscious. It is coming from unconscious roots, and this is basically what we are exposing. My understanding so far is that there are two paradigms, that were operational in terms of the representation of India and Hinduism during the colonial times. Namely, the paradigm of arrogance and the paradigm of ignorance. And of course, arrogance and ignorance, they are interconnected. So the people who were in India, in particular the missionaries, when they were writing on India, they were coming from a place of deep-seated prejudice. It was the paradigm of arrogance. But as far as Mill is concerned, he was writing from the perspective of ignorance. And that is why we find this massive projection that he made onto India. Projections, which have become distinct realities at this point in time.
That makes sense.
So let me shed a little bit more light on projection. I'm glad that Krishna broached that topic and he started unfolding this. So let's say, for instance, that I inhere in myself a lot of anger, right? And instead of looking at my own anger, I say that it is you who's an angry individual. That is what is projection in psychological terms. And interestingly, what happens psychologically also happens sociologically. So what we are encountering here is sociological projection. It was the conditions of Britain which James Mill desperately wanted to transform, which he projected onto India. It had got nothing to do with India. Indian situation, Indian reality was completely different. It's a different matter that social engineering took place in India after this discourse was generated. And this is where, we have this nexus between knowledge and political power. What happened to India based on this discourse is a very good exemplar of the nexus between knowledge and political power.
Right. So coming to the impact of the colonial discourse, how does the contemporary representation of this theory impact Hindus and particularly school-going children in the USA? And what are the long-term repercussions that you find when you observe these children as they grow up?
So everyone that's grown up has seen this narrative. The question is in how much detail, right? It's hard for me to take my own example because we had, 3 or 4 pages on Indian Hinduism in the 7th grade in New Jersey. And my teacher opted to skip it, so I don't even remember it. And many of us were blessed to not have seen it. On the other hand, many children have not been so blessed. And in California, right now, with starting in 2018, there's about 120 pages, 60 in the 6th grade, 60 in the 7th, that cover this content. And this type of narrative, what it does fundamentally is make a child apathetic to the needs of their own community and internally despise their own tradition. And that only comes out after they've left the home, once they go to college, once they look at their choice for a spouse, and what they teach their own children. Then parents get to see, gurus get to see, and they wonder what happened. This was a good Hindu household. They went to temple every week. How did this happen? Right? And I've been privy to some private conversations from very senior acharyas that ask that question. How did this happen? And there's no answer to it. But we know the answer. Now we know the answer. We didn't know the answer, but now we do. Now, in the California process from 2015 to 2018, hundreds of kids drove from the Bay Area to Sacramento. It's about a 2-hour drive, plus skipping the school day, skipping a day at school. From elementary to middle to high school. You know, the middle schoolers and the high schools could talk about their own experiences. The elementary schools talked about the experiences of their brothers and sisters and how they feared it. Mm-hmm. So we got to see the short-term impact, and we've been living the long-term impact ourselves. And it's absolutely horrifying that we let this happen to them.
And these textbooks that you refer to, are they public school textbooks? Are they special AP textbooks or your regular classes? You can say a bit more about
textbooks that come to your kids in public school. Mm-hmm. So just context in terms of how California works. There are 1,100 school districts in California. Each district makes its own choice in terms of the textbook to buy. There's 6 or 7 publishers that provide materials that they can use, and they go and sell them. Now, the state has an approved set of textbooks. They hope to approve 6 or 7, the same set of vendors, and then they send money to the individual school districts so they can use that money to buy. Now, if a book is not approved, then they cannot apply the California state money to go buy it. Well, officially, the state doesn't ban anything. Unofficially, they make their money unusable, and it achieves the same purpose. Now, California has basically sets the standard for all materials everywhere, because textbooks publishers don't create different materials for different states as much as they can avoid it. They want a standard. And unless another state says something different than what California has, and we checked afterwards, and there are none that say anything different, the California materials go everywhere. I see. And they get revised once every 10 years. So if you count for every student that goes through the 6th grade, from the time they're approved to the time they're revised, that's about 100 million kids. Yeah. Right. And it's not, we're talking about Hindu children, because those are the ones that we have testimonies for. And frankly, there are communities who are focused more, but we don't talk that much about all the non-Hindu children, which it also has an impact. And that's also large. In fact, numerically, that's the vast majority of the people that receive these materials. Yes. And so if you come back to the narrative, every religion, every tradition is perfect, except for this one religion, one tradition that is hierarchical and oppressive against its own people. I imagine what that does to people that don't belong to that oppressive and hierarchical religion and people.
Creates prejudice against Hindus.
And those are the people that go into politics, that go into policy making, that go into law, that go into all of these other fields. And now we see this narrative come across in every field. Right. And of course, it's in AP textbooks. That's not the focus here, but it's everywhere. You can't find a field where it doesn't. Kundan, you were saying something.
Yeah. So, I just wanted to add something to which you touched upon. This narrative that we have revolves around this equation. Hinduism equals caste equals hierarchy equals oppression. Right? Now, what is the general discourse within the culture of this country. It is equality and emancipation. Hierarchy and oppression, interestingly, you know, are diametrically opposite to equality and emancipation, right? Hierarchy and oppression are diametrically opposite. Now, because of this contrast, what happens is that children do not want to associate with Hinduism and India. And gradually they start disconnecting themselves, not only uh, from these studies, but also from their ancestors and parents. And by the time they get to college, this divide gets deepened and they move to the other side. So, I just wanted to bring that in response to the the questions that Krishna raised, which was what happens to these kids, when they go to college? They were such nice kids, doing their pujas at home and being respectful of their parents. But once they have moved to college, why is it that they have completely disconnected themselves, from the culture and the tradition of their parents? So this is basically what happens. It is basically because of this uh, this discourse, and its contrast with what is prevalent in the culture of the United States. So once you start looking at, how hierarchy and oppression, or the discourse surrounding hierarchy and oppression, is diametrically opposite to emancipation and equality, that you begin to really understand what is happening to the kids. Nobody wants to be, no right-minded individual would want to side with an oppressor,
Right.
right? So this is basically what happens.
Prashanti, have you ever heard of the term ABCD or coconut?
Yeah, yeah.
This is the direct outcome. The direct outcome of these materials.
It's very unfortunate. In fact, there's also a family friend whose daughter, again, the children had grown up in a very traditional, cultured family, doing puja as part, Bharatanatyam, all of these things, whatever you would want as a successful American parent for your children to do. But one fine day, the person comes home after college, and the parents are engaged in Ram Navami puja. And so the daughter decides to, keep the room locked and stays in. And so when questioned about the act of defiance, the answer is yeah, because Rama is a misogynist pig. So I'm guessing this is also one of the outcomes. This is something that's very prevalent, and I guess this is more of a question, but I have an inkling that a lot of American Indian children, when they go off to college, they move towards wokeism, in part due to this desire to rebel against what they consider to be a very oppressive religion. Is that a fair assumption?
Yeah, so let me answer the first part and then get to the second part. So the comment on Bhagwan Ram, I hinted a little bit earlier. I said there's 6 generations of scholarship on top of James Mill. And that comment on Bhagwan Ram comes from one of those scholars on that 6th generation, maybe the 5th. Right? And James Mill isn't taught in college. Right? But these 6th and 7th generation scholars are. Right? This is fundamentally why Hindupedia was started in the first place, and why we started with an encyclopedia. To provide a Hindu's insider's perspective on Hindu Dharma in its breadth. Because all we saw was outsiders' perspectives. Now, every time a student went to study, basically they became out as anti-Hindu. Right? My own friends used to come and ask me, and I knew very little at the time, but I knew enough to say, no, don't go. They'd say, Krishna, really? You're telling me not to learn about my own tradition? I said, yes, please don't. Not here. This is exactly what you're describing.
Is there an option that parents have to exempt their children from such classes or such material, or is it compulsory?
And
That is not the pathway that we should be discussing, in my understanding.
Okay.
Yeah, because I think we should focus on uh, on changing the discourse. The discourse is everywhere, even if they do not study the materials, they are going to pick it up from the culture. It is part of the culture, it has been made part of the culture because these things have been written about for a very long period of time. And let me take you back, to James Mill once again. James Mill spent considerable time in depicting the Hindus as women oppressors. That was one of the ways in which he showed the savagery of the Hindus.
Mhm.
And as I told you, that his discourse became the paradigm in which Hinduism and India studies are still conducted. So even this narrative or this discourse, you know, of Rama being misogynistic comes from what was put in place by James Mill in the 19th century. Such are the connections. And this is why, critically understanding this work becomes extremely important.
Yeah, and Prashant, you and I studied from Swamini each, right?
Yeah.
I'm sure we both taken lessons on Gita. Right? Arjun wants to run away from the battle. What does Bhagavan tell him? Can't run away. And Kundanji is saying the same thing. Even if you tried to run away, where could you run where you would actually save yourself from this narrative? That place doesn't exist on this planet.
Yes.
In fact, I jocularly say that even if Hindus decide to go to the North Pole and build igloos for themselves, this narrative will come, trailing them. So
Absolutely.
there is no escape. There is no escape. The world has been suffused by these ideas. So the only way to transform, this discourse and attain some dignity for ourselves is by taking the discourse head on. First exposing the falsehoods that are uh, behind this discourse, and then coming out with the facts. So there's a lot of intellectual work that needs to be done, which also makes this work very exciting, because it is true pursuit of knowledge that you have to engage in order to figure out the distinction between right and wrong, between truth and falsehood.
Right. And, just based on these topics that I encountered today in conversations with you, both of y'all, I consider myself somewhat well informed, and yet there are so many holes in my own understanding about this topic just because we've not had the exposure. We've, as a community, as Hindus, we've not done the research, we've not done the due diligence that's required to understand the historical precedents of these problems that we suffer from. What's the best way to present these ideas so that they may percolate in the public consciousness? Because currently, you know, if we speak in terms of academia, very few Hindus have an understanding of this. Very few parents are going to go and read up some journal. And what to speak of gurus and Hindu organizations who are relatively clueless about these matters. So how do we get the word out?
The best way is this book. You know, people need to spend some time just going through this book, maybe a month or so, and that will be sufficient. It's for a reason that Hindupedia has gone for open access publication of this particular book, which means that the book is available for a free download. And in fact, we would like to share the link of the book with you, which you can advertise. So people can just go onto the website, download the book. They don't even have to spend a dime on this book. All we are asking from people who are listening to this podcast is to spend some time going through the details of the book. And once they go through the details that are contained in this book, they will be able to find uh, paths and pathways for themselves in the future. Of course, we are going to continue doing the things that we are doing, but I'm pretty much sure that people will have creative ideas with respect to what they want to do with the contents of the book.
Let's be optimistic and suppose that a lot of people, viewers, people on different platforms do go out and they read this book and they understand for themselves. And yet there will be many, many, many who won't. What role can we play as individuals where we can, create discourses around this material? How do we engage our children? How do we engage our institutions? How does this book sort of come alive as part of one's day-to-day conversation? What's a good approach to that?
Yeah, so let me speak to that from two perspectives. Benji and I are going and engaging at the collegiate level to encourage scholars to collaborate with us or to build upon this work independently, but fundamentally to engage on it at an intellectual level. And we hope that that will be fruitful and they will take us up on the ideas that were presented. From everyone else's perspective, the best idea I've heard so far is for people to take it up as a group activity, to read it and then meet and discuss. And I think as you discuss, the ideas themselves will evolve in your own minds and in the minds of everyone that does. And that will lend itself for further conversation. The other thing that I hope this work does is make you question your own education and your own understanding of the narrative. We've all been taught some aspect of this narrative, all of us. None of us are free from that. It's come at some place, some stage or another. Even if you didn't study here, even if you studied in India, you've still received some aspect of it. Even if you think you haven't, you have. And so from that perspective, if all of it is based on a falsehood, start asking the questions. I believe this because I was taught it, but was I taught the right thing? And if you start asking that question, I think you'll start opening yourselves up for a deeper discussion and change.
Yes.
Yeah. Study groups, that would be a very good beginning. And I completely concur with Krishna when he says that we all have internalized this discourse to some level. So as we are going through the contents of the book, it would be good to stop and question our own understanding about Hinduism and ancient India. And once we start familiarizing ourselves with the falsehoods that we have internalized, we will ourselves start looking for the truth. This is how it has happened in our lives as well. We just started critically examining. We started critically questioning the things. I was I was slightly more lucky in this because my guru, Sri Aurobindo, has refuted a very similar kind of discourse in the foundations of Indian culture.
Hmm.
So if you go into the foundations of Indian culture, you will find that he does Pur Paksha on a journalist by the name of William Archer. And when you will compare, the contents of James Mill or James Mill's History of British India with the writings of William Archer, you'll find a correspondence. And Sri Aurobindo wrote this book between 1916 and 1920.
Okay.
So by then, this discourse had already become institutionalized. It had already become the received discourse, as we call in academia. And William Archer was a journalist by profession. So because of Sri Aurobindo's refutation of this discourse, I was already familiar, with what Hinduism was in ancient times and what India was in ancient times.
Right.
But once again, the reconstruction of facts will have to be done with a lot of evidence. We'll have to kind of provide a lot of evidence, to really refute this discourse. And that is the next part of the journey. I've divided this journey between what we call as deconstruction and reconstruction. So this book is completely about deconstruction. We have deconstructed the discourse. Right. Now the issue is reconstruction. We'll come to reconstruction much later. We have to further deconstruct. Once we are done with deconstructing this discourse, then we will come to reconstructing it in the future.
So speaking on that note, without giving too much away, what are some of the projects and next steps that you're working on at this point?
Krishna, do you want to
Yeah,
go into those?
so many different places that we can go. It's actually, we're taking our ideas and starting to pen them down and sharing them, and we will be sharing them openly with the different universities where we're giving talks. Fundamentally, this work needs to be expanded upon, right? Whether it goes into how James Mill institutionalized this, or looking at long-term studies on what is the impact of these kids, of this narrative on kids as they've grown up. Right, this is work that has to be done, and these are just two examples of tens that we've come up with. And all of them need study. It's very easy to say, right? Like I talked about coconuts and I talked about what happens after college. It's an entirely different thing to follow their story and to actually see and study it and formally document it and bring that into the academic world. That work has not been done. And we ourselves, of course, will dive deep into one aspect and focus entirely on it.
And Prashantji, we won't give a lot away at this point in time. The reason is that we do not want to expose half-baked ideas in the public domain. This book took 3.5 years of research, of intensive research as it got written. So, what will happen is that we will talk about these ideas. They will get picked up by people in social media. And before we realize it, a mess will be created out of them. So what we are going to do is that we are going to keep those ideas under wraps for the moment. Say within a year or so, you will know what we are doing. But as we both spoke about earlier, this is just the beginning of a very long project, a very long time project that we have. So there are going to be many pieces of writing that are actually going to follow this work.
Well, I'd really like to say, a big thank you to both of y'all on behalf of the entire Hindu community, because you've put in so much time, you've put in a lot of effort, so much research, so much, background history that you've gone into. And all of this is open source. You're not making any monetary gains out of it. You're doing this because this is something that you're driven to do, and it's for the love of our civilization and for the betterment of our people. So I think that's a great service. Kudos, hats off, all of the good accolades that I can think of, because this is something that was monumental and definitely needed. And I would just say that I've glimpsed through the book. I've not read it completely yet, but I'm looking forward to combing through the book in great detail. And from my end, at least, I will try to engage our network, for fellow Vedanta Satsangis and others to take part in this conversation, because it's a very important one to have. And once again, I thank you for coming on, and I look forward to having you on again.
So thank you. If I could close with one thing. As Kundanji said, it was 3.5 years of research, plus time to write, plus time to force it through the official publication routes. One of the things we didn't talk about was how to get it published in the right place, so it's in academia. That itself was another journey. All of this does take time and resources. At the same time, Hindupedia itself as an organization is committed to open sourcing all of our work and making it available to the community. But it does take financial resources to do so. So if you're willing, I'd appreciate if you'd share a link. If after engaging with the work, people feel this is worth supporting, then please encourage them to support financially. Of course, we won't be unhappy if they decide to fund it beforehand. At the same time, I prioritize actually engaging with the work first.
I think that's a very important point, and I will definitely share the link to the work and also encourage people to participate and contribute in what way they can, because one must, who else will support our community if not us? So absolutely.
Thank
So
you.
once again, thank you so much. It was a pleasure having you on, and look forward to future conversations.
Hari Om.
Hari Om.